5e players is going to blow your mind. They actually make new classes in this game. Not just new class, new classes.
Drawk Show.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Drawk Show. I am very sort of excited, partially excited about today's topic because I'm doing it a little bit sooner than I probably would have liked in the channel's lifetime, just because I think it's important right now to talk about what it means to be switching over from 5th edition to Pathfinder 2nd edition, because Wizards of the Coast has been pretty anti-consumer, anti-community with their recent OGL changes. And I think if you're on the PF2 Reddit right now, literally at its peak, about half of the posts were people saying, hey, I'm switching over from 5th edition. What do I need to know coming over to Pathfinder before I can get started? So for this video, I'm going to be just drawing a nice drawing of a wizard converting over from 5th edition D&D to Pathfinder 2. I'm going to be talking to a few friends over the course of the stream. Our first friend is Tristan. Hello, Tristan.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well.
So, basically, I've gone on the Pathfinder 2 subreddit, and without looking at answers, because I don't want to be taking away anyone else's content, I've kind of counted up what seem to be the most commonly asked questions, and I'm going to be answering most of what I've seen as the most commonly asked questions, that this video can be a really good resource for people to get into. I will say quickly, I'm not going to be answering a question I've seen a lot of, which is what modules people recommend. Most of the games I play are homebrew stories using the system. I'm only playing one game that is in a module. Actually, Tristan here is the GM for that game, and that's Age of Ashes. And all I can say is, if you're new to the system, I don't recommend Age of Ashes because it was the first one they made, and they hadn't quite gotten a hold of the balancing yet and stuck to that difficulty throughout. And as much as it's a very fun story and I like it a lot, it's really challenging, and I think would have been a more successful module for them if it had been like, if it had to come out like 2 or 3 years into the life cycle. I think it would be really good, but I just recommend against Age of Ashes for your first one, just because of the difficulty. So Tristan, the first thing I want to talk about that I've seen a lot of people asking about, 5e infamously has a pretty busted action economy where most actions wins fights more often than not. Stats aside, abilities aside, it really comes down to actions. Tristan, what do you think of Pathfinder 2's action economy?
I think it makes it a bit more realistic and more like grounded in reality compared to other ones. Like I think PF1 had its issues with, like it did improve upon certain things with having, or like have a good system with standard actions, move actions, and swift actions and stuff, but it kind of ended up having this weird hierarchy of actions where it wasn't certain as to whether, you know, like why could one thing be used for something but not for others, and had this strangeness. But like,
absolutely, I think 5e has the same problem in my opinion, where I mean it has basically the same action economy as Pathfinder 1. The only difference being in Pathfinder 1 there were things called a full action where you could combine your movement and your standard action into one full action, which wasn't really a thing, which isn't a thing in 5th edition. But other than that, it's, yeah, this hierarchy of you have your movement, your action, your swift or bonus action, and the idea that you can't ready something if it's a bonus action is silly. The fact that, like, if you have, well, if my spell is a bonus action to cast, shouldn't that be easier to cast and I can do multiple of them in a turn? No, because it can only be cast with bonus action. Pathfinder 2's solution is so simple. It's just 3 actions. I think, like, there's so many benefits to having 3 actions. For starters, just the fact that, like, you aren't every turn doing the same thing over and over again. Because, like, did you ever find in Pathfinder 1 that most of your turns were either full attack or move and attack, and that was all you were ever doing?
yeah, especially if you have 2 different types of characters. You either had spellcasters, which like standard action is 95% of the time going to be casting a spell.
Yeah, almost every time.
Yeah, move action generally getting away from the person who's slowly moving towards the caster, or getting closer so you can get within range of your spells. Yeah. And, you know, as you mentioned, you know, martial characters tended to be like, I either move in and attack, or like the charge action, which is a full action, or you would do a full action to attack to try and make use of all your base attack bonus to try to attack multiple times. Yeah, it really was, you didn't feel like you had much options. You felt pigeonholed into those specific ones.
Absolutely. And I think 5e is even, surprisingly, despite being better than Pathfinder 1, I'd say, in most areas of game design, for what you can do with your actions, I think it's actually a little worse because at least Marshall's had the full attack option in Pathfinder 1 and D&D 3.5, but in 5th edition D&D, where you get your multi-attack regardless of if you moved or not, it really is, if you're a caster, your turn is almost always move and cast, and if you're a marshal, your turn is almost always move and attack. And sure, you can do other things, but it's so often optimal. And there's so many ways that the 3-action system kind of mixes that up, because one of my favorite examples is just 1-action spells, and recall knowledge being an action means that spellcasters, as much as it feels a bit like a nerf, I'd say, it's more fun to play because you have choices where you're choosing, do I move and recall knowledge? Do I move and cast a spell? Do I cast a spell and use my shield cantrip? What are some other examples you can think of how that really makes the action economy feel a lot fresher?
I think probably one of the very cool and like unfortunately bad spell in most other tabletop or D&D and Pathfinder 1 was True Strike. I think True Strike in Pathfinder 2 is such a cool spell now because it's a 1-action spell. You cast it and then the next attack is basically get advantage.
Yeah.
And you also remove all kind of concealment penalties and things like that. You always hit them.
It's also worth noting, advantage is so much bigger of a deal in Pathfinder 2 because it's not a core mechanic of the game. Generally, True Strike is one of the only ways of granting advantage. It's not even called advantage. It says roll 2 attacks, take the higher. Because it's meant to be a little bit tougher of a game where there's a little bit more war game and strategy to it. Advantage is just a little bit too powerful of a mechanic to hand out. But True Strike does it, and because it's only 1 action, it's incredibly useful. I've never played a D20 game where True Strike is like a good spell before, but it's really, really useful.
Yeah, I've always looked at it and been like, I really want this to be good, but you could never really figure out. Yeah, you could never figure out a situation that made it good. So yeah, with Pathfinder 2, with it being 1 action, it makes a lot of spell sword builds really cool, and also you can even just use it to support other spells because you can cast it once, and then if your next spell in that turn you cast is a spell attack roll, then it also applies to that. So it just makes it a low-level spell really powerful or really interesting, which I think is always a fun thing in a struggle in a lot of these systems, is making low-level spells relevant in higher levels.
Yeah, so another thing I want to talk about for the action economy being sort of improved is the -10 on consecutive attacks. So a big thing that Pathfinder 2 is built around is that feeling of decision-making being fun. So having choices where you need to do different things being interesting. And they realized that in Pathfinder 1, what I talked about, the full attack, where you're not allowed to do your multiple attack from 5e unless you stand still, is kind of uninteresting to do, and it felt like you had to do it so often. So the way they've kind of brought in the penalty on consecutive attacks from Pathfinder 1, but also had it be punishing enough in this particular system that you don't often want to just spend your turn doing 3 attacks, like almost never, is the consecutive attack penalty. So each consecutive attack, unless you have an ability to modify it, that you make is a building -5 up to a maximum -10. So if you gain extra actions or extra attacks, it won't go beyond -10. But still, a -10 on your attack is a 50% chance drop in hit. So if you only had a 70% chance to hit to begin with, you're looking at a 20% chance by the end. And honestly, in Pathfinder 2, it's not uncommon when you're fighting stronger things to only have had a 55-60% chance to hit to begin with. So instead, you're encouraged to use your other actions for cool things like an Intimidate check, because with such a challenging game, putting debuffs on enemies is really important, or a Recall Knowledge to learn about an enemy's resistances and weaknesses. And I think it's a lot more fun to have the action economy disincentivize boring strategies of just doing the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, I think in general it makes using skill tests in combat a lot more like interesting, dynamic, and rewarding because
Absolutely.
they don't tend to suffer from that -5 unless they are generally more
Considered an
like
attack,
directly
yeah.
offensive moves. Yeah,
There are
that'd be
certain ones that are considered attack, and it's more of the aggressive ones that I think it's fair to not want people to be doing all the time, like pushes and grapples. But things like recall knowledge, intimidate. One of my favorite skill feats is called Bon Mot, where you basically have a clever quip you give your enemy, and it gives them a penalty to their perception and will saves until they retort. And it's so fun if you want to have like a charismatic paladin in the front line, or champion as they're called in Pathfinder 2. If you want to have someone charismatic in the front line and have a use for their extra action, they can just give this charismatic quip, and suddenly your spellcasters are lined up to have an easier time using their will save, which is equivalent in D&D 5e to a wisdom save, spells. And I love that sort of thing, having all these different options for what to do with your third action in a round. The last thing I want to talk about. Oh, sorry, you go. Did you have something to
Oh
add?
no, I was just gonna probably mention what you're gonna talk about next if it's the next the criticals and such.
Yes. So, big problem with the action economy, why people don't like it in 5th edition, is that it's really hard to do boss monsters well, because everyone will tell you it's about the arena, it's about the ads when you do a boss fight, and the monster kind of isn't the fight, which I think is how you should approach fight design anyways. Like, the arena and the additional enemies should be important, so it does incentivize good game design, but it also means that the enemy doesn't matter that much. Like, you have to make an enemy so stupidly fucking powerful for a 5th edition party to have any struggle against them, I find. Whereas that is absolutely not the case in Pathfinder 2 for two reasons, but one that we're going to talk about here is generally a boss monster is going to have higher bonuses. We know that. That's true in 5e. But that doesn't mean that much because, there's still only so much you can hit. But whenever you get 10 above the DC on any roll in PF2, including on attack rolls compared to the armor class, it's a critical success. So that's skill checks, that's saving throws, and that's attack rolls. So higher stats mean more damage, not just in the way of hitting more often, but in the way of far more likely to get a crit. Do you have any other thoughts to that? Sorry?
I think it's a pretty interesting thing, and it makes well, there can be certain times where it doesn't feel very rewarding to get more bonuses because you kind of feel like you're going to have like certainty to hit. For example, like buffing your allies to deal with mooks and stuff like the ads can feel like a waste because of course they're going to hit. Like they have a really good chance, so like why even bother buffing them? And then with this, like the situation is if you crit them, you may take them out in one hit rather than two hits. So like it does incentivizes, like it makes these even more valuable in more situations, which I think is fun. And then also you have the critical failures on top of that.
Yeah. One thing that brings up for me is I just noticed building my first high AC build in Pathfinder 2 is I was like, well, is it really going to matter that much? Because against boss monsters, they hit all the time anyways because their stats are so high, even if I make my AC as high as I can, because Pathfinder 2 is a little bit of a harder game. But what I realize is, it doesn't matter that they're hitting all the time. They're only critting on a 20 now, which means your high AC feels rewarding when you're up against mooks because you're getting hit less often, but also against boss monsters who are going to hit you anyways because you're not getting crit every second fucking attack.
Yeah, exactly, which can definitely... And there's a number of abilities, too, that especially boss monsters tend to have, that when they critical, it gets much, much worse. So you feel like you can hold much longer, you don't get debuffed, and those sorts of things as well.
Absolutely. Was there any other thought you had before we move on to the next thing?
I guess just something quickly on the flip side of that, on critical failures, there's a lot of really interesting class abilities that interact with it as well, which we can kind of get into later when we talk about class abilities through progression and stuff. But like one example I can think of is Swashbuckler. With if someone critically fails to hit them, they can kind of do their post, which is really cool and really rewarding because you kind of feel like you are further rewarded for increasing your AC and applying debuffs and stuff, and they try to hit you and you get to hit them, and it's just like a really cool system that feels like your actions matter in so many different ways.
It also makes Swashbucklers really good at disincentivizing enemies from just the attack, and crit fishing with their final actions, because as your penalty gets bigger and bigger, your chance of getting 10 below armor class are way higher, meaning that if you just swing away wildly at a Swashbuckler, chances are you're giving them an opportunity to stab you, which feels really like cool and flavorful too. Like the idea of this daring swashbuckler being really good at finding an opening when dealing with someone just swinging absolutely wild.
Exactly. Move on to the next one, I
Yeah.
guess.
So the next point is I've seen a lot of people. You're also conscientious. You D&D 5e players. You know that there are certain things that everyone finds really irritating. You know that there's a lot of people making these overpowered builds that are frustrating other players. And in 5e, it's such a problem because the power level difference between a very powerful and a very weak build is immense. And suddenly your game master or dungeon master in D&D is struggling to make something that's a challenge for them that doesn't wipe the rest of the party. So I've seen a lot of people with this conscientious worry coming into Pathfinder 2 on the Reddit and saying, how do I avoid making an overpowered character? What do people not like people playing? Are there spells that I shouldn't take? Are there classes I shouldn't take? Tristan, what's your answer to those people?
Generally speaking, it is very difficult to make something that feels like unbalanced or like it defeats the purpose of other players' characters. The game is well balanced and nothing feels completely out of left field, overpowered. Some things may be a little bit less powerful, but they usually are rewarding in different ways. That's my kind of opinion.
Absolutely. And I think, like, a lot of people that I've told that to have kind of had a question then, like, well, how are you rewarded for mastering the game? And the real answer is just doing cool shit. Like, if you know how to build a character more precisely, your character won't necessarily... I say won't necessarily. They won't be better. Like, a really bog standard, out-of-the-box barbarian is going to be as powerful as my most power-built character I've come up with, which I talked about on stream recently, Big Al, Captain Endoran. And Big Al is very good at what he does, but he does something specific. He's this incredible shield fighter who can protect his allies really well, but while that makes him really, really good against a crowd of mooks in a hallway, we've learned, he isn't really that good against a big boss monster because they can rip his shield apart too quickly to really do anything, and his damage is too low to end the fight quickly. So it's really, really hard to make a character that's overpowered or underpowered, I'd say. And Game Mastery more rewards you with making a character whose abilities are more niche, or a character whose abilities are more unique or cool aesthetically. Rather than with power, which I think is a way better way of rewarding your game knowledge when it comes to building a character.
Yeah, you have a lot of more neat things to do in weird circumstances, or like the things you do aren't necessarily just like defeat boss faster. It's more about it'll change the environment or the situation in a way that can make it more advantageous or just different. Like tripping the enemy has like a downside, like it imposes a action economy debuff for them, or just an AC debuff, and that's kind of nice. But like also just hitting them will do good things too, because obviously like lowering their health.
Yeah.
And there's other things like the bon mot you mentioned earlier, and going charisma focus and as a side part of your character. There's so many different ways to improve your character, but it's more about like widening than it is about making it tall.
Yeah, and I feel like game mastery, like, or understanding the game, your game knowledge rewards you with, when it comes to power, it doesn't really reward you in the character buildings process, because that's all like creativity that's really rewarding there. It rewards you with your actual gameplay decisions, understanding how to act tactically. And I think in a system like D&D or Pathfinder, where combat is built to be what a lot of the game is built around, I see a lot of people who talk about playing D&D 5e and they prefer roleplay to the combat side. In my opinion, first of all, play a different system. D&D, all of the abilities come back to combat, and I would really recommend playing a game more built for engaging roleplay, where a lot more of the mechanical reward comes from roleplay. But if you're going to want to play something where combat is a focus, I think you're going to have less of those people who are like, well, I don't really like combat, if combat is engaging and difficult and has tactical choice to be made. Because I really don't think Pathfinder combat is that complex to learn and get a hold of, but there's so much more you can do to be really effective in Pathfinder 2's combat. with the choices you make and how you use your action economy. Like I said earlier, it's kind of a meme in the community that if all you do is attack, 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 that's sort of seen as the worst choice you could make in most situations. So figuring out what you can do with that third action is a lot of learning the game better.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a fun thing about looking, like, if you are a type of person who likes to look through, the database or look through all the books and stuff and trying to find every single piece of information that can make your character more powerful, you end up being rewarded with just finding what to, like, something to do with that third action or other things. Like, you just find, like, neat little pieces here and there, and you're like, oh, that's a little cool thing. And it's more interesting, or provides a little bit more information, or provides that little extra thing on top, but it's not so game changing that the person who spends hours and hours looking through the system is going to be leagues above someone who just is a casual player and wants to have fun and maybe asks a
Yeah.
couple questions.
It's like the edge you get isn't huge by having that mastery, but it's enough that it really feels like engaging with deeper mechanics is meaningful. And something that I really like about the design is that a lot of the classes that I'd most recommend to new players, the class feats will kind of instruct you on what kind of other options you have outside of just attacking. Like Rogue and Barbarian have a lot of things to power up your Intimidate abilities. So they're kind of teaching you, hey, you can use Intimidate to demoralize. And Fighter will kind of teach you about disarming and things like that. I find a lot of the simpler martial classes come with feats that kind of guide you in, hey, these are things you could be doing with your other action, just so you know.
Yeah, I think even just a good example of a class, well, that might be a little more complex than, say, like a fighter or something, the Swashbuckler, which we mentioned earlier, I think is amazing for all of its different focuses,
Yes.
its styles, because, like, there's one that's more acrobatics focused, and so you can be like, okay, how can I use acrobatics and athletics in combat to, accomplish different neat things that can give me an edge. And then there's, like, the intimidation one, and there's so many different options that it has that kind of teach you
Flip the canvas.
the different mechanics in combat and out of combat, I think, as well.
Yeah. Out of combat abilities are so much more present in PF2. That's not something that we're going to touch on much because it wasn't something that people really asked about. And I really want to focus on the questions 5e players are interested in. But absolutely, out of combat abilities are so much more present and powerful and interesting. And a lot of people will say, well, a good game master, dungeon master, will just do those anyways. And that might be true, but having a codified bonus to what that does specifically can be so important, I find, for, like, it feeling interesting to do that. Like, one of my favorite skill feats for diplomacy is if one of your friends fucks up, I can't remember what it's called, if one of your friends fucks up and insults somebody, you can distract them with a charming compliment as a reaction to prevent that character from lowering the NPC's opinion of them. Which,
Yeah,
I think that's great. I love that.
yeah, I think that's also kind of fun for, like, a dynamic if someone doesn't invest all of their progression towards, like, diplomacy, but they still want to be, like, a diplomatic character, they want to engage in that aspect of the role playing, then it's not like they're going to do something and then ruin maybe the encounter for people, because, like, the diplomacy focused character can kind of help support them in some cases as well.
Another one of my favorite social feats. We're going to move on to the questions in a sec, but another one of my favorite social feats is just Glad Hand, which at a penalty you make a diplomacy to make an impression on someone immediately instead of needing the conversation to go on for a couple minutes, which it does by default. And I think that's just such a fun ability for, like, if you're trying to schmooze and move quickly, very, very quickly on the fly, make someone like you more.
Yeah.
And it can also make the conversation immediately start out with a favorable impression, which is huge.
Yeah, it's fun to have that aesthetic of just being so immediately charming. Which is a fun thing for a lot of different characters.
Okay. So the next one, and this one's probably going to go on a bit longer, is... Oh, wait. I can't read the complex notes right now. Someone has added something. Do you want to read that last note in What to Avoid for Game Balance real quick? Oh, it's about rarity.
There's a few here. We have, like, the weaknesses, like every build has weakness. I guess we kind of discussed that a little bit.
Yeah, I think we touched on the fact that, like, your build, if you build it stronger, will still have situations it doesn't shine in.
Yeah, the rarity system for feats when it comes to it's the different feats in available to the different classes. Most of the ones that are added in the main books, the core rule book, and a couple of other ones, Advanced Player's Guide and that stuff, don't tend to have rarities, but a lot of the ones that are more built into the world, they tend to be like this person teaches you either from adventure paths, which are like the pre-made adventures, or those things have rarities, and they tend to be either are more uncommon or rare because of kind of they're meant to be taught by a certain individual and kind of rewarding for this tie into the lore, or they are a bit more possible to break game balance or throw off at least a story.
Yeah. I find with things like backgrounds, backgrounds and ancestries, the rarity tends to be less a little bit about power, and sometimes it's not about the power as in what's more powerful, it's power as in what does weirder things that game design doesn't necessarily account for, will be locked behind rarity doors. But often the backgrounds, especially, it's flavor. It's like, hey, one of these ancestries is android, and the idea of cybernetic androids in your game might ruin the flavor you're going for. So this is a rare ancestry. Basically, rare and uncommon mean the same thing to the player, which is you need GM approval to use this. But to the GM, it is up to them to decide what they want to include. Uncommon is basically suggesting, hey, this will slightly alter the tone. It's a little bit less common. It's something you need to consider and account for in a lot of situations. And rare, it's saying, hey, this is going to be a demanding change to the tone. The precedent that this sets is going to make your setting and story significantly different. So really consider, and I really love the rarity system because it's a great way of adding in all sorts of the weirder ancestries and classes and everything without the issue that I find happens in a lot of role-playing games, which is you're allowed to use everything in the book, the GM says, and you end up with a campaign with like a squirrel person, a demon, fishman, and a robot. And you've just got to try to keep the Lord of the Rings tone you wanted to go for despite that.
Yeah. Yeah, and on the flip side, like looking at those ancestries, which definitely have a lot of tone, and then looking at spells and things, I think like spells, like, examples like teleport, things that if you really want to engage in this aesthetic of roaming throughout the wilderness, and like the navigation's a very difficult part, and the players just say, "Oh, good thing I have teleport," and they just throw that to the side. I mean, if as a GM, if you really don't want that to be a problem, then you can do that, and that's why it is labeled with uncommon to have agency.
I really like stuff like that. There's also an item that's uncommon, and I think it's really good for it to be because it's not game breaking, but it is a little bit powerful, called Ring of Wizardry, that gives you extra arcane spell slots per day. And I've had it allowed for me. I allowed it for you. It is just fairly powerful that arcane casters have access to this item that other types of casters don't. And it kind of makes sense because wizards are the ones who know the inner workings of magic. That's part of their whole deal. So them being able to get extra spell slots from a ring makes sense. But at the same time, it is a bit unbalanced that they would have access to this thing that other casters wouldn't. So I think making it uncommon is a really good choice to let them have that flavorful design, but also have it be built in that GMs are allowed to say, actually, that doesn't fit what I'm going for here. I think it's a little bit broken.
Yeah, I know there's at least a couple things for other classes as well. I believe there's a druid item that's around 10th level or so.
Was that core rulebook?
It might be core, or it was APG. I think it allowed them to either improve their wild shape or made their wild shape more times per day. It was along those lines. So it didn't increase their spell
it's not
slot,
per day. It's a focus spell.
Oh, right. Yes, that's what it was. I think it just improved it then. I can't quite recall.
Hard to talk about focus spells and something built to be about questions people have coming from 5e, because I don't think anyone would ask it. Like, I don't know any question that would provoke focus spells, but they're very cool. But
yeah, and there's also just cantrips. I think that cantrips are an interesting thing to talk about, like the keeping casters relevant. Even
when they run out of spell slots, they have something to do. We can just talk about that real quickly. Just cantrips, much like 5e, level up as you do, but instead of being like 5e where it's just at 5th level to compensate for martial characters getting multi-attack for the first time, they generally increase their damage dice over time, level after every 2 levels whenever your spell level goes up, so that you are consistently keeping pace with a regular attack from a martial. But the reason that it still doesn't mean you deal as much damage as a martial is that cantrips, unlike an attack, take 2 actions. So there's a bit of a cost to it, but it means you're still relevant on the battlefield, no matter what level you're at, when you run out of spell slots.
I think in general too, just because of how many modifications you can make to through items to melee weapons. For example, adding the runes, which add extra damage dice. So like just the standard scaling striking runes, as well as things like the flaming runes and stuff. You end up, and then on top of that, your strength. You end up doing a bit more with every hit compared to a spell.
Usually,
but that's also but it's not substantial, and there's also the risk of having to be in melee.
Yeah, like a Big Al, because he's a low damage character built for high toughness, I would say only does about a cantrip's worth of damage on a shield throw. But on for Big Al, he's making like 1, 2, 3, 4 attacks per round with his reactions and his action combined. Whereas a spellcaster at most is doing 1 cantrip per round. So there's still the martial advantage there. It's just so that spellcasters are still relevant when they're out of spells.
For sure. And also it means that like if you're wanting to hold on to spells for later on, maybe you have a boss coming up and you have that idea in your mind, you can be like, well, I can be conservative, and that doesn't mean I shoot a crossbow or something like
Yeah.
I think was a big issue in PF1, and it may be an issue in
5e. Not really. The combat cantrips in 5e are okay. Eldritch Blast is amazing. So if someone dips into Warlock, they basically are playing in the same realm as Pathfinder 2, where they have a fairly martial equivalent cantrip, but most of the cantrips are weaker than most martial attacks in 5e for certain. I think at about 5th level, when they first power up, they're pretty good. They tend to fall off pretty quickly from there.
That makes sense. I don't know if there's anything else. Maybe like rare. I think that's.
I really quickly want to talk about backgrounds, just because I mentioned them earlier. What I mean by rare backgrounds are really flavor demanding. One of the rare backgrounds is Time Traveler. It's a background for someone sent from another time. One of them is being from another world, which you've been isekai'd, and I gave that to someone in the sci-fi area of the Pathfinder setting. Yeah, there's a sci-fi area. It's weird. You can ignore the setting and still play the game, though. And you can see how a GM might look at someone who wants to play as a time traveler and go, I don't quite think that's the tone we're going for.
Yeah. And also certain things, like even one which I think is a bit more mundane, but it is very demanding for a GM, is like Amnesiac. So it's like the character knows nothing about their backstory, but then you as the GM have this demand of coming up with the entirety of a character's backstory, unless you want to work with them, but
yeah,
you can do.
Still, it is demanding, and I think that's the right word to use for why a background would be made as rare. Okay. Why do people say it's complicated is the next topic, because I've seen this a lot on the Pathfinder 2 subreddit with people coming over. Short answer, it's more complicated than 5e. It is. I think it's not as complicated as people pretend it is, and it's not as complicated as it sounds. It really just is that it's a more different game than a lot of D20 systems, so there's a lot more that you need to learn fresh. But I think if you were starting from nothing, it's not that much harder to learn than 5th edition, at least in my opinion. So the first thing that we should talk about is feats, because feats are the entire game.
Yeah.
You got general feats, you got ancestry feats, you got class feats, you have skill feats, and that feels like a ton to wrap your head around, which very understandable when you're coming from a game where a feat is a thing you can get every 4 levels, and you have to give up your ability boost to get it, where it's going to be this much less common force. But it's not as bad as it sounds, because you only have access to the pool that makes sense to your character. Just so I can focus on the drawing a bit, and so that I'm not talking over you too much, do you want to lead us off talking about how you kind of perceive feats in Pathfinder 2?
Yeah, sure. Why I think that they're not too bad, and I think that the resource that is available to everyone playing Pathfinder, which is Archetypes and Multiclassing, it's a database that has like all the information for Pathfinder, because Paizo is more than willing to have all the mechanics, like the crunch, just freely available, and they make all their money off the adventure paths.
Yeah.
It has a really good table that kind of shows your progression and what you get at every level, and so you can kind of take it step by step. You starting at level 1, you can look at things, and it's not too crazy. And So, for example, I'm looking at like a fighter, and you get a fighter feat at level 1. It's like, okay, well, that's my only choice. I make level 1. So then you look at the fighter feats, and looking at them here, you have like 5 or 6 options at level 1, and that's all you have. So it's like not too overwhelming, in my opinion, to look at them and be like, okay, which thing kind of fits the vibe I'm going for? All of them tend to be pretty good, but it all kind of just depends on what type of character you're making. And then you move on and you're like, okay, that's your choice. You go on, and then like when you the next time you get a feat, you look and it expands a bit, usually about around the same amount, but you're already kind of familiar with the ones you've had in previous levels. So I find it easy to work with as long as you take it slow and you start at a low level and work your way up.
Yeah, I think building it is not a game. Thankfully, it is unlike 5e. I really don't think there's any reason you would ever need to start Pathfinder 2 at a high level. Because if 5e, well, the argument is at level 1 everybody's the same, so it's kind of boring. That really isn't the case in Pathfinder 2. The classes are so front-loaded, you start with so many of your options that you really don't need to worry about it being boring if you start at a low level. And building the character as you level up is actually pretty easy. It feels like the right amount of abilities that you're never having a dead level, that you're always having something to do, which I think is really what you want in an RPG. It really just is. If you tried to build like a level 5 character from scratch, not knowing the system, it's incredibly overwhelming.
Yeah, even for me, like I think going like it is always a lot of work to make like a level 5 or 10 character because you need to think about all the different choices you're gonna make and you kind of make it step by step. It's just time consuming. There was actually a good comment which says they saw feats in PF2 as more like the level abilities in D&D instead of the D&D feats, which I totally agree with. Like, when you compare like even PF1 to PF2, a lot of class abilities were removed and got turned into feats. So it's more that you just kind of have choices at levels, which, I guess, yeah.
And I love that because a big issue I have with 5e that I know a lot of 5e players have, don't lie to me, is that you see the same abilities over and over and over and over and over again. Because every time you pick the same class, you are given certain abilities as a guarantee. Sure, you make a couple choices, like I think Warlocks have the most choice. They're the most a la carte character. But fighters are always going to get their action surge. Druids are always going to get wild shape. I guess wizards don't have that much. They always get at least. But for the most part, you're seeing the same class abilities every time you build a character. And I think that gets kind of boring. So instead, the way that Pathfinder 2 is built is most of your class abilities are kind of a la carte. You build as you go, you pick class abilities, and what it means is not every druid has wild shape. Not every paladin is immune to fear or immune to disease. You get to have these very, very diverse characters. The anecdote I go to over and over again because I think it's so important is between the ones I've played and GM'd for, I've experienced 5 level 1 rangers. I thought it was 4, but it's actually 5, and only 2 of them played anything alike at level 1. Otherwise, they've been incredibly diverse. Wait, no, it is 4. I remembered. One of my rangers I started at level 5. I have played or GM'd for 4 level 1 rangers, but all but 2 of them were entirely different, and I think that really speaks volumes to how diverse the character creation is based off of class feats. So while it is complexity, I think it's kind of the good kind of complexity, and you end up not needing to know all the class abilities you didn't take, only the ones you did take.
And I think that also helps facilitate a lot of different like role playing as well. Like if you want to be the crossbow, the guy who uses a crossbow, it's like okay, well, rangers can help with that. Want to be a person who uses a bow? Well, the ranger has a bow build. You want to be in melee as still the ranger can do that, and you still have this kind of aesthetic of being in tune with nature, or like skilled in the woods, like a true ranger aesthetic as well.
You want to end up using rangers are good for once.
Yeah, that is true. You could also end up using more spells as well.
In Pathfinder 1 and 5e, rangers were not good.
Especially, I'm not as familiar with 5e, but in Pathfinder 1, rangers had the issue of being a spellcaster, sort of. It was like the worst spellcaster.
Yeah.
Because they had a lower spellcasting level.
And unlike paladins, they didn't have a bunch of unique spells to make up for the low spellcasting level.
Yeah, exactly. And so it ended up feeling like, here's a thing that's not as good as everyone else, and it's not going to be that useful to you. While in Pathfinder 2, rangers have the focus spells, which are, spells you get back on short rests, is kind of how I would describe them.
If you can take a 10-minute breather, you get your ability to cast focus spells back. They're made to be a consistent part of your build, but not something you can spam.
Yeah, and rangers have such really interesting ones. Like there's ones to teleport traps a short distance. There's ones to make your weapons hit harder. There's ones to help like improve your animal companion, make it larger, make it like heal it and stuff like that. There's so many cool things that engage with different ranger builds on a magic way if you want to have that magic ranger aesthetic. Alternatively, you can just go with a full mundane one and just martial and focus on it, and it also feels rewarding.
And we're going to talk about this a bit later, but you can get that partial spellcasting flavor and be more powerful by having a dedication feat. And again, we'll talk about this later because it was a common question I saw from people who've done a bit of research. But you can get a dedication feat to gain access to a weaker version of the spellcasting of druids or clerics. So you can get that same vibe if you want it. It's just not a necessity of the class, which I think is such an important change because it really was hampering druids, or hampering, not druids, rangers in both 5e and Pathfinder 1, that they were losing martial abilities to be spellcasters.
Yeah.
And especially in 5e, paladins didn't lose out for that because they got an ability to directly convert their spell slots into martial power with Divine Smite. 5e rangers don't have something like that. Like, the closest they have are things like Hail of Thorns, but that only applies to ranged rangers, which means the melee build of ranger doesn't really have much in the way of spell support. I know recently with Tasha's they changed that a bit, but it's still nowhere near as good as it is for paladins. And I just love playing a game where the class with my favorite flavor is actually a viable and interesting class to play with a unique identity of being this focused, prowling character. So the next thing about complexity that I've seen a lot of people talk about is traits and conditions. There are a lot of them.
Yeah. In general, I would say that traits, specifically traits, we'll speak about that quickly. They tend to not be as relevant for players and are more a thing that GMs need to handle. And I would also say that a lot of them are more reactive than they are something that does something on their own.
A big thing that I will say about Pathfinder 2 is I do find it's a lot more complex for GMs than for players. If you want to run it, it's a bit more demanding. If you want to play it, it really isn't that much harder. The amount of extra bookkeeping you have to do, other than changing everything on level up, but we'll get to that in a bit, isn't very significant. It really just is for the GM. There's a lot more that you have to know, or at least a lot of databases you need to be ready to search for traits to make sure you're using them right. But for the most part, there are exceptions that I don't like. They do something very similar to what you'd expect, so it's pretty easy to create shorthand for them mentally to track them down.
Yeah, and it also a lot of times makes like sense. Like if a trait has we'll say a spell has the mental trait, then it probably doesn't affect mindless things. It's like some of them are pretty straightforward and grounded in reality.
Yeah, there's a lot that I like about the traits there. Like I like that you can just, instead of having to clarify immune to fire damage, like something could be immune to fire spells, or something could be harmed by a spell that has the fire trait, or a really good use of this that I like is the Elementalist Sorcerer, because sorcerers, their spells their spell list is actually determined by their magical heritage, which I really like. But one of them, the Elemental heritage, if you pick something other than fire elemental as your elemental heritage, you still gain fire spells, and it just says, hey, if a spell has the fire trait that you gain, you can replace the fire trait with water, earth, air, and replace the damage type from fire with bludgeoning, which I think is just a cool way of using traits to have a really quick swap for the sake of flavor.
Someone asked in chat for us uninitiated to PF2, what exactly are traits in general?
Yeah. So traits do exist in 5e. They're just a lot less common. It's basically a descriptor that's attached to anything at all. So a common thing in 5e will be, it'll tell you, like, is this spell enchantment? Is it necromancy? There's just more of those in PF2. And it is probably the biggest point of complexity, but again, in a way that players don't need to engage with to nearly the same extent. So some examples, we're going to get into one of my favorites later, but it's the incapacitation trait. That one is probably my favorite trait. I think it's great for game design. I'll talk about what exactly it means a bit later, but it is what's put on anything that incapacitates fully. So whether that's paralysis or charming an enemy so that they are on your side, Anything like that would be a trait. Weapons can have traits, like Agile is the trait that lets you use... Finesse is the one that lets you use your dex to hit. Agile is the one that gives you a smaller penalty for multiple attacks.
Yeah, it becomes really relevant for, I think, weapons. Like that. Luckily, weapons don't tend to have too many unless they're more like the advanced weapons, which are a separate thing you don't need to necessarily look at, and are more of a fighter.
You can ignore it as a new player.
Yeah, and so they usually have a few, and it kind of really determines what advantages that weapon has apart from its damage dice.
So, like, an axe will often have sweep, which means your multiple attack penalties reduced if you're attacking multiple different people lining up, because you're sweeping from one to another. Agile reduces your penalty for attacking just in general over and over again because it's light and easy to maneuver. Something forceful increases your damage on repeated attacks because you're building momentum with this big, heavy blade. And they all tend to be fairly basic and easy to process like that. But the real good thing about most traits is they tend to be exactly what you'd think. So if an ability has the auditory trait, if something can't hear it, it isn't affected. If something has the visual trait, if you can't see it, it isn't affected. And I really do like that, for the most part, they're that simple.
Yeah, I would agree.
Exceptions.
With exceptions, yeah. But and also certain things, like it helps to really codify what exactly a monster is as well. Like, for example, I think there are certain things that affect plants and then also plant-like creatures. And if they have, I believe there's a plant trait or something.
I think there's a plant trait.
Yeah. And so that really codifies it. If you look in the bestiary or just on the Archives and Ethos, you'll, as a GM, be like, okay, I don't need to make a judgment call. This is just, that is what it is.
Yeah.
And also really interesting things, like if you ever take on like plant shape, or there's, I think, certain a druid ability if they go into the plant, like not domain, but order, which
Order of the Leaf.
Plant, then yes, leaf. Then you can, I think, eventually get the plant trait instead of your humanoid, and it's really neat because it really embodies that, like, you're transforming because you're becoming one with that group, which I think is very thematic.
Yeah. And it also means that anything that only targets humanoids, which is less common in this game than it was in 5th edition or Pathfinder 1, admittedly, but anything that only targets humanoids can no longer target you because you plant.
Exactly, which I think, yeah, thematic and also has certain advantages. It's very cool.
I'm a really big fan of how they handle traits and how most of them are easy to understand.
Yeah.
Conditions?
Yeah.
Conditions are a lot simpler because they don't come up as often, so you can really easily just rely on searching them. I've been playing Pathfinder 2 for literally since the week it came out. I still rely on just searching Pathfinder 2 conditions at the beginning of most sessions, so that I'm ready for that.
Also, the Game Master screen tends to have a majority of them.
Yeah.
Which I utilize as well as a GM.
Yeah, so you don't have to memorize those. They don't come up often enough that you're going to be at a huge disadvantage if you don't have a perfect memory of exactly what all of them do.
Yeah, the ones that do come up more often, like, prone and flat-footed, those ones you'll probably just start to remember because they're not too complicated.
And they're so common to come up that you will just remember them, but they are also pretty simple. There's also certain conditions like stupefied and enfeebled or clumsy, which tend to be pretty easy because they're just effectively penalties on everything related to the stat that it sounds like they'd be related to. So enfeebled is things relating to strength, clumsy is relating to dexterity, stupefied is relating to wisdom.
Yeah, I think especially just relying on the Archives and Ethos as well really helps you, like, just have that quick, easy to reach for database and resource that do take you maybe 5 seconds or 10, and then you have it in front of you. Very nice.
Okay, what's our next note on complexity?
Complexity, we have the alchemists and prepared casters are a lot of bookkeeping effort.
Yeah, there are a lot. I stand by. A lot of people disagree. This is a very contentious opinion to have in Pathfinder 2. I think the Alchemist is the most powerful class in the game. I think if you go by what you see them do on the board, you will not believe that. And if you go by what you see them do played by someone who's not familiar with the system, you will definitely not believe that. They are also the class most powered up by new books because they gain access to new potions every time Paizo makes a major release. Not potions, but elixirs, bombs, etc. But they are so goddamn complicated.
Yeah, I would agree. They were, I think I played one as my second or third character. I can't quite recall, but
Hmm.
it was a lot. I think the bookkeeping for them is quite a lot, and if you dislike bookkeeping, then I definitely avoid them. They're really cool though. I found them probably one
Yeah.
of the most refreshing classes to play in a
The,
tabletop game.
the biggest advantage that they have, and I'm going to say this so that people who say, because a lot of people like to hear a challenge, they're like, I'm smart enough to handle the most complicated class. If you're going to, try to remember that your biggest advantages and the thing that makes you the best class in the game is you can offload the action economy cost as well as the stat requirements for all of your items by just handing shit to your party. Because the
Mm.
alchemist main thing is they make special little potions and items and stuff. So they are so much more powerful if they just let the people who are better at using things use them. Like the poisoner is so good if you just use it to put poison on your allies' weapons. If you use it to try to poison people directly, it's terrible. It is a really bad
Mhm.
class.
Yeah, they're a distinctly unique and interesting support class, and I think that you just need to kind of think about how you might help the rest of your party or directly do, and what you can do directly, and kind of balance both of those.
God, this guy's arm is fucked. I'm gonna be honest. I spent a lot of time not sure what I was gonna do for the composition for this, and just kind of made it very quickly. And because of that, the anatomy is not great. So we're gonna be doing some fixes here on
Yeah,
this here wizard.
that's just as well.
Um, so yeah, then for prepared casters, I actually like the way they've chosen to do prepared casters, even though it is a difficult system compared to what 5th edition does for things like wizards. Basically, you have to prepare every single spell slot, and why I like it is it makes sorcerers relevant, like they were in Pathfinder 1 and D&D 3.5, because the big issue I have with sorcerers in D&D 5e is being a spontaneous caster in 5th edition is basically just being a worse caster, because prepared casters can expand on their library of spells, they can purchase spells, they can pray to gain new ones, whereas a spontaneous one, they're locked into the same spells per day as everybody else who have the ability to adapt reflexively and spontaneously, but they don't have the advantage of being able to expand what they know, and I think it's exclusively a disadvantage. Whereas in Pathfinder 2, the spontaneity that you get in exchange for less breadth with a spontaneous caster is actually a worthwhile change for a lot of people, which I like a lot. I think it's really good for spontaneous casters to have a role.
Mm.
However, preparing every spell slot is hard.
Yeah, if you just want to be a spell slinging character, but not have to like really think about how many times you're gonna have to cast one spell or another spell, and kind of really, make the judgment calls on all your spell slots, then I mean, spontaneous casters are a solid option. They have a lot of interesting options and like certain advantages over the prepared casters,
Mhm.
um, and also some downsides as well. But like they're just easier to use, so
It,
that's good.
and if you really want the flavor of a prepared caster, but you don't want the bookkeeping of preparing every spell slot, they've actually added something just to help people coming over from 5th edition who really want access to that flavor without the really crippling cost of having to prepare every spell slot, which is in the Secrets of Magic book. There's something called a class archetype, which basically you can take from level 1 instead of needing to immediately take a feat for it, like most archetypes. We'll talk about that in a bit. And it changes your spell casting to effectively work like a spontaneous caster from 5th edition, where you are able to just prepare your spell slots and then move them flexibly from your spell book. And it's a great option if you're coming over from 5e, you want the option to play a wizard, and you don't want to be preparing every spell slot, but it comes at a great cost, which is you lose 2 of your cantrips and you lose an entire spell slot per level, except for the magus because they already don't have many, and I think every magus should just be a spontaneous caster because 2 cantrips isn't that big a deal. But yeah, you can just angle that direction, and I think it's a great option if you're coming from a system where you don't have to do as much bookkeeping to play a wizard or a cleric, and you want the option for that sort of character, and don't want to deal with. Again, preparing every spell slot sucks. I don't like it. I've done it before. I don't like playing some of my favorite classes flavor-wise just because of it. And yet I will defend it as good game design because it makes sorcerers more relevant.
Yeah, and I think that like there are advantages, disadvantages. I think that certain classes like the cleric, for example, who has access to their entire list at all times, and uh, which makes sense to an extent, and I like that as an option, and I think helps them continue to be competitive, even and make them less of just a heal bot.
Yeah.
Also, Travis has joined us, by the way.
Oh, Travis is in call?
Yeah.
Hello, Trav, you there?
Hi, yeah, I am
Hi.
here. I didn't want to interrupt the conversation. I just thought I would sneak in and you know, just be here
Nice.
until the conversation had a lull.
We're currently talking about how Pathfinder 2 is more complicated than 5th edition, and where some of the complexity comes from, and how to avoid that if you don't want to deal with the complexity as a new player.
Totally. Yeah.
So you made the genius choice with your character of being a spontaneous caster and not having to deal with preparing all your slots.
Yes. Because I am a lazy player. So but you know, I won't say like lazy and new players play very similarly, but they kind of
It's
do,
common,
right?
yeah.
It's the I don't want to do that much work to have fun, right? So
Yeah.
I would say on the whole, there are some people out there who, you know, I love the numbers, love the grind.
I mean, that's Tristan.
And
Tristan wants to do homework for his games.
Yeah, and that's valid. That is a valid way to play the game. But that's not the way I play, and that's obviously not the way some people play. I did catch the little tail end of your conversation here, and yeah, like having to prepare each spell slot is a pain in the butt. But the flip side, the flexibility that offers is immeasurable.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, our party is going to go dungeon delving or dungeon diving, right?
Oh yeah, we've seen
I'm
over
just
and over
going to
again.
prep of these.
Sorry, you go.
I'm going to prep all of these spells that I know are going to be useful in a dungeon. Whereas a spontaneous caster, they're like, yeah, I guess I just have what I have, and let's see if we can make it work.
Yeah, and I think we've seen many, many times how as much as Bronwyn and other Tristan, there's another Tristan, and Sean all struggle to deal with the bookkeeping. They also have the adaptivity of like every day having different spells and how huge that is. How many times Bronwyn's cleric has saved us from some unique condition by the fact that we just need to rest up and then she can just have a different spell ready.
Yeah. Whereas as a bard, you know, my character is locked in to whatever spells. I mean, my bard's a little different where I can switch out a spell because I took the bard
Muse.
is it the Enigma? No, it's the
Yeah, I think the Enigma Polymath.
Polymath, thank you. Essentially it's the equivalent to like D&D's schools for bards. But
it is
mine
what
allows
entity inspired you to connect to the emotional bandwidth of the universe.
Yes. It allows me to swap out a spell.
Which does make you more
day.
adaptable than your average bard.
Yes. Yeah. But again, actually, just comparing the two classes, even the way that D&D does their spontaneous casters is a little bit different. So for new players, there still is that learning curve, but it's obviously much less than the prepared casters.
Yeah. I think the closest that you could get to the D&D casting experience is playing a prepared caster but taking the spontaneous casting class archetype. It is the closest you could get because it gives you the list that you prepare from, but also your spell slots that you prepare are entirely fluid.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. What's our next note?
It's newer classes are complex and built to interact with the game's core mechanics in interesting ways.
Yeah, so that's when we talked about Swashbuckler being a bit more complicated. Despite being a martial class, that's largely because classes that came out. You're gonna find this crazy, guys. 5e players is gonna blow your mind. They actually make new classes in this game. Not just new class, new classes. So the classes that came
And
out after
and more than once every 5 years.
yeah, it only took them a year to do the first set of 4. That is a rate. If we compare 11 years of D&D 5e to one class to 1 year for 4 classes of PF2, the speed difference on new classes unquestionable. But yeah, the newer classes tend to, instead of being just sort of a basic toolkit, they all tend to have abilities that make them interact with the action economy or other core mechanics of the game in a unique way, which is so fucking cool for being able to feel like your game mastery is really rewarding. And it's why I think most players tend to move away from the core classes as they gain experience. But it does make them not a great idea for new players, in my opinion.
I 100% agree. The advantage that D&D has is that all of their classes are very, I don't want to say simple because it's like, oh, they're easy to play, but
some
like
of them have some complexity, but yeah,
yeah,
the
majority of them have very simple and easy to understand mechanics that you can just jump right in and start playing as, you know, oh my god, as like an artificer, right? You can just start playing. I would say that's probably one of the like a little bit more complicated class comparatively to your fighter, your rogue, your uh, wizard and stuff.
Yeah.
But on the whole, it's a lot simpler comparatively than if you were to play an investigator.
Yes.
In Pathfinder.
Because the investigator's core ability is something that interacts with the action economy in a unique way, which, if you don't understand the action economy and its ins and outs and how to gain benefits from it, like, it's very easy to understand the action economy in a simple sense, but when your class abilities are interacting with it in a very complicated way, you really want to have a lot of experience with it before you're going to play that class.
Yeah, I would say 2 examples of newer ones that are quite complex in their design is like Inventor and Thaumaturge, which you end up using things like temporary items, which kind of has the Alchemist, like the Alchemist, not problem, but like complexity to it, as well as having just a lot of different choices they make throughout their development of their like levels that are usually small, but there's a lot of them, and they're not really like you pick one path and then you kind of just develop it. It's usually quite spread out, and so you end up accumulating a lot of different things, and that can be quite complex and hard to like have a quick understanding of what you want to do or what you like, what this actually lets you do.
And I think those classes, in my opinion, are some of the most interesting classes in the game. They're really cool. They're really fun, and I would recommend that you just play at least one fairly long game before you switch over to them, just because as much as the abilities are awesome, that collection of items does make it a little bit hard to understand.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I would. I would definitely recommend like hopping, like if you're just transitioning from 5e to Pathfinder 2e, would 100% recommend playing one of the core classes, or playing a class that you've played in D&D, and play that class if it's available, obviously in Pathfinder, because you'll already have that core understanding of what that class wants to do. Which, if you're learning the mechanics of Pathfinder, will help you a lot more. And so by playing, as you said, a longer game as one of those classes, using a class you already know as training wheels, you'll be able to understand the mechanics, which makes you able to understand the entire, like, a newer class a lot easier. Because you already will get the core mechanics, and so it's just, more ingredients to the sandwich.
Absolutely.
Yeah. As a quick devil's advocate, at least I'll say that some of the newer classes actually they do have somewhat of a pushed core build with them that you can kind of plug and play, and some of them aren't too bad. Looking at maybe like Psychic or Magus.
Yeah, Magus I feel like is a bit complicated just because you have are you in Arcane Cascade?
Yeah, that part, but I don't think that's pivotal to how the class plays. But just as
Well-
devil's advocate, I think you can do it, especially if you're willing to put a little bit of time and
Yes.
effort. Like I'm trying to wrap your head around some.
Totally. Yeah.
I also
I mean,
think,
I
like,
think-
sorry, Trav, you go.
I was just going to say, I think that sentiment applies to all of Pathfinder 2e. If you're willing to put in the time, you can. It's easier to understand.
If you're not willing to put in time, like you just want to plug and play, easy go, I think like you're gonna have a great time with sorcerer, rogue, barbarian, fighter. I think they are all. There are easy builds for all of those, and everything else. There's varying levels of work you can put in to really make it work for you. If you really,
I'd also throw rogue on that list.
oh, I meant to say rogue. Rogue is also pretty
Okay.
simple in PF2.
Yeah.
I think rogue and barbarian, in my opinion, are the two simplest classes.
But yeah,
I
All
think
right.
so.
What's our next note?
what builds or spells do GMs and players hate?
Yeah, so this is a big one. Again, 5e players being very conscientious about like what stuff is busted, what ruins fights, and I think if you played a lot of 5e, you know a lot of this. Like 9 out of 10 situations can be solved with a polymorph. It is such a busted spell, everybody takes it. Almost every spellcaster who can is going to take haste. People are sick of seeing the coffee lock. People don't want to see your warlock, paladin, hexblade. So, lad, Tristan, I think you're heading out not too long, but while you're here, you've GM'd. What spell just ruins Pathfinder 2? What build or spell is too game breaking as a GM?
I don't think there's anything in the system that is wholesale it breaks the game. The only things I can think of. Go ahead. Yeah.
I 100% agree. I haven't run into any player ability that I hate while game mastering. Not a single. No, one, and it was this week.
Oh, which one was that?
Kristen using his ability. Hypnotic Pattern, Pip. Yeah, if you're talking about 5e, Hypnotic Pattern is one that people overlook, and it's absolutely disturbingly good. Thanks for the comments, by the way. If I Levitate in 5e, people overlook how busted Levitate is. But in PF2, my player earlier this week used an ability he got from Adopted Ancestry. I gave him permission to take Adopted Ancestry Poppet, which are little enchanted toys, because he's a cat robot who looks like a cat, and he wanted the ability from Poppet to, while he looks like his disguised thing, be unnoticeable by default. And I was like, cool, that's fine. And then he took a class feat from Psychic that allowed him to deal a small amount of damage without any noticeable effects, just psychic damage from concentration alone. So he was sitting in a war camp, looking like a goddamn cat, unnoticeable, giving people headaches every turn. That combination is the first ability in PF2 I've disliked as the GM.
I think maybe just
I
that
didn't tell
people.
him that
Yeah.
I was going to do that because I knew he wouldn't like it. I knew that.
He's here! Kristen's here!
Yeah.
Just in
that
time
feat
to
by
defend
itself.
himself.
Yeah. I will be heading up, but as a final note, I'll just say the problem especially is just that feat itself, because it has no verbal component. It's exclusively a concentration on mental, so no one else, unless they're using, I guess, maybe like a detect magic, maybe.
That's the only way they could do it.
Yeah.
I think that feat is the first player ability I've been like, but even then, I, as GM, gave him permission to use a rare ancestry for Adopted Ancestry, which is not rules as written. So it is on me that it worked as well as it did. Like, it's definitely... It is a thing that I did to myself as the GM, so I'm not even too mad. But that Psychic feat is bonkers on its own. It isn't rare. Although is Psychic an uncommon class?
It was broken because we broke it.
Yeah, okay, it's uncommon. So at the very least, because Psychic's uncommon, you do still need GM permission to let it get as bad as it got. But I did let it get bad, and it was the first time I've seen a single player ability be overpowered in a way that it made me mad.
Psychic actually is not an uncommon class. I'm gonna go though. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for being on, Tristan. It has been great.
Yeah, good to hear from you.
Yeah, take care.
Okay, Kristen.
I think... Sorry?
No, you go, Travis.
I was just going to say, I think in that particular circumstance, you turned the right knobs, right, so to speak. You matched up the right, lines to create that. I don't want to call it an abomination, but to create that scenario, right? Like you had to line everything up in a certain way, in a certain circumstance, right? Like, if that were to happen in an area where there were there was magical surveilling, right? Like the cat would have been found out.
The cat
would have been like ping 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 ping.
The cat luckily was found out eventually because the warlord,
Okay.
she rolled a nat 20 on Seek and happened to be looking in the right direction. So I had to get a nat 20, and then Tristan, who just left, pointed out, well, Seek is a 30-foot cone. So I was like, fine, I'll roll an on-table d4. If I get a 1, she was looking in the right direction to see the cat. Was a 1. She saw it. She saw the cat.
Yeah, fair enough.
But had that not happened, the cat would just said that they're giving her team an aneurysm to death.
Just slowly microwaving their brains.
Yeah.
It does so little damage, but it's so just stupidly powerful to not have any components at all.
Yeah, I fully expected the kibosh to be put on that about as quickly as it was. Even if it was by dice roll.
Look, I let it be by dice roll. I want it to be fair, but God, that was... Okay, so PF2, can you break it? Kind of, but I've only seen it once, and it was by Kristen, who, if someone's gonna do it, it's him.
Oh, shucks.
Look, I trust you to break a game.
I would say, talking about breaking games, as you said earlier, D&D, polymorph, really, right?
Absolutely.
If they fail their save, it's like, cool, that giant dragon that, maybe you've used up all of its legendary resistances and saves or whatever, and it fails its save, which is easier to do in D&D.
Yep.
Hello, wizard.
Yep.
You slap it, you turn it into, I don't know, say a goldfish.
Yep.
A sheep.
Literally
anything.
As both of us recently talked about has been done to us.
Right? And then you just take the said sheep goldfish, and you, I don't know, throw it in a volcano. You lock it in a cage and put an anchor on it and drop it in the ocean, right? Like,
Yep.
And there goes the boss fight. Is now easy mode.
But now's the point where I get to go back to what I said is my favorite trait in PF2. Incapacitation. Why is it so good to call all spells that incapacitate an incapacitation spell? Polymorph is the goddamn reason, because the incapacitation trait in PF2 and 5 EGMs, I know you're going to love this. Remember when earlier I said if you ever get a nat 20 or 10 above the DC, you get a critical success, and whenever you get 10 under or a nat 1, you get a critical failure? Well, there's another little side to that, which is there are certain abilities that upgrade or downgrade your save result, and one of those is incapacitation. If the creature is more than double the spell level rounded up, sounds hard to calculate, you get used to it, it's worth it for what it does, they get to treat the result of their save as one better. Meaning, if you use Paralyze to try to paralyze a boss monster, and your spell level isn't at least half their level, they get to treat their failure as a success, and they are not paralyzed. Now, it's why a lot of incapacitation spells in Pathfinder 2 aren't just save or suck. They actually have some level of small effect on a success as well. That way you don't feel like you've wasted your turn. So Paralyze, I think, slows them by 1, so they lose 1 action on their next round, which on a boss monster is still very meaningful. But it's so much fucking better that someone can't just use a hold person and shank your boss to death. Holy fuck, do I hate spells in 5e. Spell design in 5e is my least favorite part of the system. Kristen, do you have any memories from when we played 5e, or Travis, do you have any, because you're DMing it right now, of just your least favorite moments of incapacitation spells in 5e? Because I could go on.
Yeah, I'm just, like, my party always resorts to polymorph.
It does everything.
Yeah, they, especially if I put them against a creature that they know has a low, I think it's
wisdom for polymorph.
I think it's a wisdom save.
Yeah.
But they will figure probably has a low wisdom. They go boop, and the max monster that I put against them maybe has a +2
Yep.
to wisdom, and they're like, yeah, my save's 18. It's like, okay, all right. At this point, I don't even want to roll. But yeah, I definitely think. Just trying to think of another spell that they've used to
a big one I've seen a lot of is at low levels, because it's only, I think, a level 2 spell. If there's a martial enemy, you can cast Levitate on it in 5e. It levitates into the air. It just had to do, I think, a wisdom save, maybe a fort save. It levitates into the air, and then you just shoot it with arrows while it can't do anything. And unlike Hold Person and a lot of spells, like Dominate, there are no additional saves. They're just levitating for life now as you pepper them to death with arrows.
Yeah.
It's
they haven't quite done that. A spell that I don't say frustrates, but I think is super overpowered for what it is Misty Step.
Misty Step is bonkers.
Spell, it's like, you can do what as a bonus action? Excuse me.
I want to briefly talk about...
You can move and then Misty Step? Okay.
I briefly want to mention, because Not Husky 14 in chat just said, a tough enemy in my game was stuck with Tasha's Hideous Laughter for 4 rounds, failed every save after being attacked over and over. Tasha's Hideous Laughter in 5e is also disgusting. Like, oh god, Tristan, is that what we used in Colin's game against the werewolf?
Oh, I think we used Moonbeam on the werewolf.
No, you're right, we used Moonbeam on the werewolf. I think at some point we used Tasha's on something, but I can't remember what it was. But Tasha's Hideous Laughter, I actually really like what they've done to Hideous Laughter in PF2, because it's still very useful. We actually just, Travis and I, the game we're in, we just saved our goddamn lives with it recently. But you have to sustain it every round, and it only costs the person who failed. It costs them 1 turn that they lose their turn if they critically fail, but after that they just lose an action. So you're spending an action to sustain it, and they're losing an action because you've targeted them. So there's a big cost to it, but a big effect. I think that's balanced. I like it. I like Hideous Laughter in PF2.
It really makes sense, because it wouldn't be as effective if you're fighting a group.
Yeah. Oh man, Hideous Laughter. All 5e's lockdown spells are busted. If D&D 1, I mean, frankly, I honestly hope if they don't change the OGL from what they've said it will be, I hope very few people support D&D 1, but if they do and it is a supported game, they need to change the lockdown spells in 5e, because, like, watching Critical Role, I'm like, oh my god, I'm so invested, are they going to win? Cast Hold Person and shank a guy and get guaranteed crits for 3 rounds. And I really don't like that the answer that we're supposed to give is that the GM should also use that, because who likes being a player and they get paralyzed and no longer get to play the game?
Yeah.
Like, that just sucks.
Well, because it creates a lot of feel bad moments.
Mm-hmm.
Right, where you're just, again, on both sides, as a GM or a player.
Yep.
You're a GM. You've prepared this wonderfully constructed, like, combat, and you're like, okay, this is probably going to happen, and then the players go, yeah, Hold Person, rogue, get in there, crit every time, get your sneak attack damage.
Rogues, paladins, like, there's so many classes that if they get to crit, it's fucked.
Yeah.
The only thing worse,
like, okay, cool.
The monologue.
Oh, oh my god, yeah. I'm gonna boost Kristen's audio, you're just a little bit quiet.
Oh.
No problem, not your fault. There we go. Boosted you should be about level now. Yeah, it's... Oh my god, yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and then on the flip side for players, right? You're playing, you're like, this is a sweet boss, and say if you're playing against like a spellcaster, and they're like, you're held, and the player can't do anything, and then the boss's minions all come and shank them.
Yep.
Favorite Saber Suck. Welcome to Suck and Suck.
Tristan is still in chat, and he just said that generally the removal of autonomy, especially for players, feels bad. Absolutely correct. Like, as a GM, you don't mind if your mooks are incapacitated, which is why I think incapacitation spells working on lower level stuff is fine. But, like, your big bad you've been building up for 13 sessions, you don't want to be paralyzed for the whole fight.
Mm-hmm.
You gave him cool abilities. And players, like, they're there to play the game. They only get one character, so their character not being able to do anything is not a fun time. Alright. The next thing to talk about, how hard is it to make a challenge for my players who roll through combat? A lot of 5e players I was noticing were talking about how they're sick of trying to make challenging fights and just having them be stomped on. I think we've touched on this a lot, but I think we can all just agree, right? PF2, like, you don't really feel like there's one-sided stomps that often, huh?
No, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, you can tell we're Canadian.
Yeah, we're so polite. No, you first. No, I just feel, as someone who has, I was GMing a Pathfinder 2 game for a little bit, and so I was preparing combat through that, and also, the D&D 5e at the same time, and the preparation, for Pathfinder, in my opinion, was so much easier.
Well, because the levels mean something.
Yeah, it was so much easier than prepping for D&D, because as we talked about earlier, it's like, okay, I need to memorize, essentially. I need to memorize each of my players' spell list, so I know, like, they'll have hold person, they'll have polymorph, they'll have this, they'll have that. So I have to make sure I prep for all of that. Just so, I'm not going to throw a challenge that's too easy, or I'm not going to throw a challenge that's like, okay, well, they killed, 7 wolves. It's like, should I throw 14 at them, or are they ready to face a troll, or like a handful of trolls? Like, what's...
And trying to figure that out is so difficult.
Yeah.
Like, the balance system in Pathfinder 2 is really, really simple. And because everything adds its level to everything, the levels mean something. So a level 13 monster is 5 levels more powerful than a level 8 monster. What were you going to say earlier, Kristen?
Oh, I think that it also, like, adding every mook pulls their weight.
Mm-hmm.
Just in terms of taking either actions away, or because if you're throwing in, like, very low level things, you can make a satisfying yet challenging encounter just by throwing 14 kobolds at a relatively high level party, and it doesn't feel like a sweep because because it'll take time to deal with this problem, and you can have a lot of moving parts without it feeling like filler enemies, basically.
Yeah, it's something that I really like about the system, is that it does feel like you can get the most out of a group of small enemies, and they've actually added rules that once your players get too strong, if you feel like you can't challenge them, you can actually start to treat medium enemies the way you would a swarm and call them a squad, to even further make use of that. But yeah, I find like I can create a good challenge out of everything, because the encounter budget builder is really specific about how many of what level of enemy you need to create what type of threat.
Yeah, and also with Pathfinder, comparatively to D&D, is basically how many actions everyone is going to have. It is a thing, like, everyone's action economy, as opposed to D&D, where it's like, I get 2 attacks at a certain level. I get a bonus action that does this. I get, another action, or I'm a fighter and I can action surge X amount of times.
If you spend a lot of time calculating damage per round doing 5e boss fight building, which if you're doing 5e, I think you should calculate damage per round for your party to try to create a good threat. That's what I do when I'm DMing 5e. you would love switching to PF2 because being able to just like look at the level of the enemy and change the abilities of your homebrew monster to match the expected stats of the level, because the monster builder, there's a tool called the monster tool online that's really good, Pathfinder 2e monster tool. You can make a monster through that, and if you build it appropriate to the level, you know it will be a good fight, and you don't need to calculate DPR.
Is the math work?
Yeah, the math just worked. They did the math for you this time. Which, in my opinion, bit of an advantage. Was there anything else I put in this section? I don't think so. How do archetypes and multiclassing work? Because a lot of people who are tangentially familiar with the system know that it's different. You don't just take a level of something anymore.
And I mean, I almost think it's better.
I think it's entirely better because it let them front load the classes with abilities, and you can multi-class and gain some flavor from another class without losing your class's core features like spellcasting or your ability with your weapon.
Yeah, and it also doesn't load you up with, say, 4 or 5 core abilities.
Yeah, having to track the core abilities of a fuck ton of classes when you're trying to build the build you want. Like, I've talked about him before, the YouTube channel Tulok the Barbarian. He makes these 5e builds, and he'll be like, I built Knuckles the Echidna. He works the way Knuckles should. Just ignore the fact that he has, like, 8th level spell slots. Because to get Wild Shape, to give him a burrow speed, I had to, so...
I was just going to say, like, with multiclassing in D&D, every level that you take, like, for example, say if you're a level 10 character, you've got 5 levels in Paladin and 5 levels in Rogue. I don't know why I chose those two. They don't really go together, but, like,
they do with the Assassin.
Character.
Assassin, Rogue, Paladin is a bonkers combo.
But in my opinion, like, you're half as good as a level 10 Paladin, and you're half as good as a level 10 Rogue.
Yeah.
Because you haven't fully devoted your levels to that one class. Whereas in Pathfinder, it's an archetype. You could be that's true, 2 different ones. You could be a bard with the archetype of a barbarian.
Yep. And while there's not a lot of synergy there, it's still cool.
I miss sculpts. I want sculpts, please.
So to talk about how it works quickly for everybody, every second level you get a class ability. We mentioned that before, called a class feat. That's basically a special ability for your class, and you can choose any of those times, instead of taking a class feat, to take a dedication feat, which dedicates you towards an archetype. Some of those archetypes are just to give different weapon styles to classes that might not have them. So for instance, there's no two-handing feats for Barbarian. They can't use 2 weapons by default. They don't have feat support for it. But a Barbarian can and should, because it's a really good build, take the dual weapon warrior archetype, which gives them a bunch of the fighters and rangers 2-weapon techniques as feats they can take from then on. Sure, they had to spend their level 2 feat dedicating towards the dual weapon warrior, but from then on they can start taking feats for the fighting style they want, which I think is cool. Now,
you don't, and the dedication feats they're not just like a, hey, you've unlocked this. They do give a small benefit,
like 2-weapon warrior I think gives you twin strike from fighter, something like that.
Yeah.
The ones that don't give you much, they usually just give you a skill proficiency, are called multiclassing feats, which are dedicating yourselves to learning the basic principles of another class. So the way that those work is, let's say I want to dedicate as a wizard. All that does for me is it gives me training in Arcana. Nothing else. Like, the multi-class ones are purposefully a little bit weaker for the dedication. They don't give you a cool on-activation ability the same way. But from then on, I can start taking dedication feats such as basic wizard spellcasting, which gives me at level 4 a first level spell slot, which isn't that much, but like we said earlier, True Strike, pretty great. So I built a ranger who took dedication wizard, and I gained True Strike, and that was awesome. And then after that, I took a feat from wizard to gain a thing called Bespell Weapon that whenever I cast a spell, I can put a bit of the spell's energy back into the weapon to deal a bit more damage. So I could True Strike to gain a bonus on my arrow, fire it with a little bit of magical energy in it. And as you go, if you keep up with it the entire time, you're never going to have spellcasting anywhere near a wizard, but you didn't lose your basic weapons abilities. You just lost some of your class feats that give you extra special powers. And in exchange, by level 20, if you've dedicated to wizard the entire way through, you have 8th level spell slots. Well, one of them. You have 1 8th level, 1 7th level, and if you've taken the feats for it, 2 spell slots of 6th and under. And that gives you so much potential for support spells on a martial build that I think it's just an amazing way to do multi-class design.
Another thing is that the archetypes and multiclassing, like the archetypes, they don't have, like, you get a class feat every 2 levels.
Yeah.
But the archetypes, they don't have, most of them don't have 10 feats that you can take.
No.
Some of them have feats you can take more than once, but generally speaking, you're not going to be taking those archetype feats for your entire level up, assuming you go to level 20.
Yeah.
And you only need to stick with them for 2 feats generally before you can switch to another archetype.
Yeah.
Which lets you do some really interesting combinations.
Yeah, but because you need to get 2 other feats before you can switch, it does limit you a little bit so that you do have to spend a bit of dedication, which is why the feat to get into an archetype is called a dedication feat, because it's not meant to be dipped into the way you can with 5e levels, where you take a level of this, a level of that, and kind of pick and choose all your abilities that way, which is something that I really, really appreciate as far as the design goes. I also really, really like the idea that there's some classes, some archetypes that are skill-based, and the difference with the ones that are skill-based is that when you dedicate towards those, they give you access to skill feats, and skill feats you get every 3rd level separately, or every level if you're a rogue or an investigator, because they're insane and are good at skills. But what that means is, because the skill feats that give you access to also count for the archetype, you can actually leave those archetypes a little faster because they want to be kind to you and are like, hey, if something's focused around skills instead of combat, it should require a little bit less to have fully committed to it in this game built around combat. And I think that's really fair design.
Yeah. There are a few different, like, they're not like official types of archetypes, but there are, say, good archetype as a monk, as a fighter. You get monk abilities, but say you don't really want to be a monk, you just want to do hand-to-hand fighter, in which case you'd archetype into martial artist.
Yes, which opens up an unarmed fighting style without needing the monk flavor. So if you want to be the fighter who punch things, you can take the martial artist and gain access to a bunch of the monk feats.
Yeah, and I don't know if there is any specific like distinction between the class archetypes and the.
They're called multi-class dedications.
Are they? Okay, cool. Well, yeah, because that's one of the really fun options that are there for people who want it.
Absolutely. So we talked a bit about that. We don't have that much left to talk about. How easy is it to homebrew your own setting? I don't think any harder than 5e in my opinion.
No,
I would say it's about the same. I did it for both. I homebrewed settings for both, just as easy. I would, even coming up with different out of combat challenges, and it's essentially the same once you understand how the levels work in each system and how to gauge, what is a challenging obstacle for D&D and what's a challenging obstacle for Pathfinder. I feel the developing, if you have a long campaign in Pathfinder and you're homebrewing a world with challenges and locked doors and such, there, as your party levels up, there will be checks that you need to make that will be a little bit harder as they level up.
Oh, because you add your level to everything, so that includes skills you're proficient in.
Quicker than D&D, because D&D, your proficiency doesn't go up that quickly.
No, whereas Pathfinder, it goes up about as quickly as 5e, but then you also add your level to it.
Exactly.
Which means it goes up much faster.
Yes.
Something that I think is worth noting, that as much as it's a little bit harder to get the numbers right, because the numbers for a good check at low level and high level aren't that different in 5e, Pathfinder also gives you a lot more to work with for what a good DC is. There's a DC by level chart that is so helpful that I refer to all the time. Yeah, as far as homebrewing your own world, something I think is worth mentioning is that, like, people talk about Pathfinder being a lot more baked into its setting, and I think that's partially true, but really only in the Lost Omens setting books. Other than that, everything is about the same as D&D for, like, how much the content is tied to the setting.
Yeah, it's not like you choose a fighter and the fighter's first ability is named Joe Schmuck's Punch of Ages or something.
Yeah, actually, that's a good... No, you actually make a good point that it's in a way less linked to its setting than D&D 5e, because D&D 5e, so many spells have a wizard's name on it, like Tasha's Hideous Laughter, Tensor's Floating Disc, etc., right?
Yeah. Like, I don't know who Tensor is.
Who the fuck is Tensor? Why is it his disc? I made the disc! Whereas, and that's any plane you go to in D&D. You can fly wherever you want in Spelljammer, and it's still named after Tensor for some reason. Whereas, Pathfinder also tends to make its spell names in PF2, not PF1. PF1's a nightmare. PF2 tends to make its spell names really, like, simple. Like, Hold Person is just Paralyze, because Hold Person could mean lots of things. Paralyze means Paralyze.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I like. But yeah, I don't think it's that hard to homebrew a setting for. I've done it a few times. I've stopped doing it only because I actually really like the Pathfinder setting. I just think it's good.
It is good.
Whereas D&D 5e, I find, like, I don't like the D&D setting very much. I love the monsters. That's about it. Everything else, I think, is kind of flat. The cultures don't have a lot of texture, in my opinion.
Well, that's... I don't know how much that stems from their sort of... their baseline mantra of let people fill in their own details.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
It makes sense that they'd be more interested in the monsters, because that's the stuff that, like, you need to put game mechanics behind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So only one last topic here, which is, what is the pace of level up? Because I saw a lot of people noticing that it takes 1,000 experience to level up at level 1, and they're like, well, I'm used to the journey from level 1 to level 2 being pretty quick. This doesn't seem like my kind of game. So I think we can all agree, like, the pace of level up for level 1 to level 2 is much slower.
Yeah.
Like, D&D wants to get you to level 2 very quickly.
Well, D&D getting up to level 5 takes 30 seconds, right? Like, it's comparatively to Pathfinder, the classes are, like, I think also the big difference, because the pace of level up between the two is so different. When you're level 1 in D&D, you're as strong as, like, a wet napkin. Like, a band of goblins has, like, 10 TPK.
It makes
that
sense,
is
yeah.
a thing that can happen.
Because you don't have your class abilities yet. Like, you have very, very
Yeah.
little at that point. Every level 1 character is so similar in 5e.
Yeah, but in Pathfinder, level 1s, you know, they aren't quite wet napkin.
Yeah.
They're like paper towel strength. They're a little bit stronger. They're still weak. Like, you still feel like a level 1, but you can at least kind of hold your own. If you have a nice, GM who isn't like, I want to TPK everybody all the time.
I will say, in our most recent game I did, that we started, I did almost kill... I guess that's not the most recent, but one of the more recent ones, I almost killed Chris at level 1 because we'd been playing, like, level 17 characters, and I forgot how weak level 1s were, and I bonked him on the head, and he went unconscious, and I was like, oh, he's level 1 again.
And he just kept doing it, too.
Look, since then, I've just kept rolling really good bonks against him. Clubs are his weakness. But Yeah, you aren't going to be in level 1 a lot longer than in 5e, and it's something you got to be ready for. But it's like Travis said, you're not as weak, and it's like I said, you have more of your class abilities, so it doesn't feel nearly as punishing to be in that zone. The only time I struggle to be a level 1 in Pathfinder and find it frustrating is if I'm planning on making my character have a particular dedication, because you don't get those until level 2. So just being like, when do I get my stuff? When do I get my stuff? When do I get my stuff? That's the only time that I don't like it.
I feel also the...
Nope. Sorry, what was Kristen going to say quick?
It's not fun to be bored at a low level.
Yeah.
You're just saving.
Like, I think it's a sign of game design, in my opinion, that so many players in 5e are like, look, everyone starts at level 3. Level 1 doesn't exist.
And that's, I think, it feels like almost a purposeful game design by, like in D&D 5e, where, yeah, skip the early stuff, get me to the good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Get me to where I'm a wizard casting fireball. Like, that's what I want.
Actually, something that makes me want to mention real quick is that I find D&D 5th edition tends to have an issue, in my opinion, where high levels it breaks down again. There's kind of a sweet spot at about level 10 or so where the game is really fun, or sorry, level 9, where the game is really fun, and then after 9, I find it's really hard to challenge your players because the abilities they've gotten mean that if they have advantage of the action economy, nothing really threatens them anymore unless you put a ton of work into it. Like, people who run actual play shows that go beyond that level are putting in a lot of labor to make the game work beyond that point. And I feel like high level... Pathfinder 2 is the first D20 game I played where I think high level's just as fun, if not more. Like, Trav, I don't know... The highest level you've done is Age of Ashes, right?
Yeah.
And
I haven't got...
Sorry, you go first.
I was gonna say, I haven't gotten to play with, level 20s and going, like, doing a one-shot or something.
And Kristen, the highest you got with Ravnok was like level 15 or so?
Yeah,
so
there.
See, I feel like those are levels, though, that in 5e I find kind of uninteresting. Like, I think the system breaks down a little, and I'm normally looking to start a new thing. How do you guys feel about that, like, level 15 and 14, which is what each of you have gotten to in PF2 experience in Pathfinder 2?
I think they do a good job of giving you things to look forward to.
Okay.
All the way through. Because I don't think there are a ton of peaks other than, say, level 3 when you get your first general and your first ancestry.
Yeah.
Or heritage. Yeah. I forget which one it is.
Maybe when you get ability boosts.
Yeah. Yeah, and every 5th level when you get your characteristic boosts as well. But those, again, you don't get them once and then you don't get them again. You get another one every set number of levels. So at 15, I felt at level 15, it felt like I was the same level of power relative to level 10 as I had been at level 10 compared to level 5,
Yeah, it's a linear progression in most ways.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that too. I feel like when you gain, like, the further levels you gain, obviously you get more stuff to do. You're more flexible. You're more adaptable to situations.
Yeah,
but I feel like because I've played around with some 5e level 20s. I've done a few like one shots. And yeah, you feel powerful, but like I couldn't imagine playing a campaign with them as I could Pathfinder, because it's like, or as Kristen said, it's you have something to look forward to. Every level, you're like, okay, sweet, I'm gonna level up. I'm gonna get level 8 spells now. Fantastic. I can start looking at those and seeing which ones I want if I'm a spontaneous caster. Or if you're, a cleric, you're like, sweet, I get access now to this whole chunk. Fantastic. and it feels more. You feel more accomplished, I think, in Pathfinder because of the way their level up system works with their proficiencies. Because it's like, oh, instead of now getting a plus 14, I'm now getting a plus 15 on everything that I'm trained in. Or I guess it would be plus 17, but regardless, you feel unlike D&D, where your proficiency only goes up every, is it
I think it's 4 levels.
4 levels that your proficiency goes up?
Yeah, I believe so.
I think so, yeah, because it goes up. Yeah, I think it's every 4 levels.
Yeah. So it's every 4 levels that you feel like, oh, I am now more skillful.
Y'all, I am in a crisis at the moment because I came into this with a joke I was going to put on these Wizards t-shirts where the Dungeons & Dragons wizard had something, and then it had changed into the Pathfinder equivalent. And I told myself I don't need to write that down and I would remember, and I do not. I have forgotten the joke. I need to know what to put on these Wizards t-shirts now.
Sounds like you're a real 5e wizard right now.
Oh my god.
Because what I was going to say is that I think it's important that all of your abilities scale as you level. Because in 5e, when you have an ability at 3rd level, by 12th level, you're likely not using that ability very often, if at all, because you have a 12th level thing that you can do that outstrips it in every way. But but in PF2, when you hit 12th level, you gain another thing that is very useful, but it's just as useful as the choice you made at 3rd and 4th and 5th and so on level, because those have scaled to be as useful as everything else in your arsenal. You know?
I think that's true, largely, yeah.
I don't think that's necessarily as true in 5th edition.
Guys, I need a wizard joke. We need a wizard joke stat. Can't be done until I have a wizard joke.
A wizard joke, eh?
What does he have on one shirt? What did I have?
Yeah, what was, do you remember anything from your original joke?
No, nothing. It was like a roll something. Like the D&D 5e wizard wanted you to roll something, and then the Pathfinder 2 wizard wanted you to roll the Pathfinder equivalent. It couldn't be initiative. That's in both of them.
I mean, roll a will and a wisdom save.
It can't be that. That's nothing.
That means nothing.
What if one of them said, "I'm a stupid," and the other one said 2nd level?
What? What does that mean?
I don't know.
Kristen, what does that mean?
I'm Fireball.
Okay, Pip suggested the same thing as Travis.
Yeah.
Pip, I appreciate the help. What? Oh, boy. I had a joke. I came in with a joke. Oh, no.
Well, you had access to writing implements or something.
I wrote so many notes. I wrote more notes for this than I have for any stream, and I didn't write down my wizard joke. How do we end up here?
One shirt says roll like a wisdom or a will save, and the other one, what's the ability that you get that if you succeed on a will save, you automatically critically succeed?
Travis, I appreciate the help. I don't think that's anything also. And what I'm going to say is,
dang it.
Right now, if you're watching this video, it is transitioning to the final draft where I've cleaned this up a bit because this one's a bit messy. There is a joke on the wizard shirt. Look, it's panning over. Right now it's panning over the left wizard. Oh, now it's going to pan over the right wizard. Okay. And after a little while after that, it's going to start panning out over everything. And in that part, I'm going to be thanking my 2 guests for showing up, as well as Tristan earlier. I had a great time talking about this. I'm sure in the future I came up with an amazing wizard joke, even better than the first one, and it was actually a blessing in disguise that I didn't remember my wizard joke going into this stream. Look how good that wizard joke is, everyone. Kristen and Travis, is there anything you want to say?
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on too.
It was a blast, guys. This was a super fun conversation. I think this is a really important topic right now because a lot of people are going to be switching over. I hope if you guys do so, you are as in love with Pathfinder 2 as I am. I hope everybody out there has a wonderful day. I'll see you next time.